My name is Victoria Sterling. I'm 34 years old. I served 11 years in the Army as a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. I've been deployed more times than I care to count, and I've buried more friends than I ever imagined I would. What I never expected, what I was never trained for, was the day my own family would drag me into court and try to erase my honor in public. The courtroom was freezing that morning. Or maybe it was just me. I sat on the edge of a wooden bench, the air thick with cologne, perfume, and judgment. My sister, Olivia, sat across the aisle, legs crossed, polished and perfect, completely unmoved. Beside her, my mother, Eleanor Sterling, widow of the late General Franklin Sterling, clutched her pearl necklace like it could protect her from the shame of my existence. I wasn't nervous. That feeling had burned out of me somewhere between Helmand Province and Bagram. But I was aware, hyper-aware of the glances, the stares, the under-the-breath scoffs. And then they called my name. Victoria Sterling, please approach the stand. I stood slowly, my boots echoing across the marble floor like gunfire in an empty hallway. I wore my old navy blue dress uniform, pressed and clean. And on my left chest, pinned exactly 2 fingers above the heart, was the Medal of Honor. Before I could even raise my right hand to swear in, my mother stood up suddenly, violently, and shouted across the courtroom, her voice trembling but loud, "You don't deserve that. Remove it." Every neck turned. Even the stenographer stopped typing. My sister didn't even flinch. Instead, she leaned in and added with a smirk, "Fake veteran." The bailiff moved toward them, whispering something inaudible. The judge raised a hand, but didn't speak. No one did. I looked straight ahead. I didn't argue, didn't plead. I simply reached up, unpinned the Medal of Honor from my chest, and placed it on the table beside the microphone, gently, respectfully, as if it were still sacred, even if they didn't believe it. The room fell dead silent. No papers rustled, no shoes shuffled, even the air held its breath. And that's when I noticed the judge's eyes drop to the plaque, then rose slowly to meet mine. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. That moment when I laid down the one thing that had kept me tethered to the world was the most humiliating thing I had ever done. And I had been shot twice, lost 3 ribs, and watched friends bleed out in a burning Humvee. But nothing compared to this. My own mother shouting me down, my sister calling me a fraud, and no one, not one single person, standing up to say I earned that. I sat down without looking at anyone, my hands folded in my lap. The space where my medal had been felt colder than anything I'd felt overseas. Olivia's attorney stood confidently, smoothed his lapel, and stepped forward. "Your Honor, we maintain that Ms. Sterling, despite her claims of service, has manipulated the Sterling estate during a period of emotional duress. She moved into the property uninvited, overrode medical directives, and has since attempted to assert control over assets not legally hers." He gestured toward a screen where a grainy photo of me was displayed, sitting on the edge of my father's hospital bed, holding his hand. Another photo of me in the backyard, opening the old tool shed. They made it look like I'd broken in, like I'd forced my way back into a home I had once built pillow forts in. He continued, "This case is not about military medals or dramatic outbursts. It's about property rights and the exploitation of an elderly man in declining health." The words slid across the floor like oil on ice. Slick, cold, dangerous. I didn't say a word. My court-appointed attorney had advised me not to speak. Not yet. Not until we could present our evidence. But so far, we hadn't even been given the chance. They were painting me as a manipulative parasite, and the court was nodding along. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. Some were reporters, others family friends who hadn't spoken to me since I enlisted. They glanced at me, then looked away. One woman shook her head. Another whispered to her neighbor. I knew what they were thinking. How dare she show up in uniform and expect sympathy? They didn't see the years I spent patching up soldiers younger than me, dragging them through dust and blood and gunfire, whispering lies like, "You're going to be okay," even when I knew they weren't. They didn't see the nights I sat by my father's bedside, changing his dressings, helping him breathe through the pain, waiting for him to say one kind word he never did. Instead, what they saw was a disgrace. A woman with a medal she shouldn't have. A daughter trying to steal a house she didn't earn. A soldier who had apparently faked it all. And I let them believe it for now, because I knew something they didn't. I knew that sometimes silence is sharper than any rebuttal. And when the moment comes, when truth finally walks through the door, it doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. And that moment, it was coming. But until then, I sat in that courtroom, stripped of my title, my history, and my father's name, waiting, watching, enduring. Because I had survived worse. And I knew how to win a war without ever firing back. Not yet, but soon. 6 months before my father collapsed, I was still at war, not overseas, but back home at the Sterling estate in Vermont. I'd been called back from active duty early. He'd suffered a minor stroke, or so they said. I arrived on a humid afternoon and found the house quiet, too quiet. When I walked in, the living room was empty, except for my father seated in his favorite leather chair. He looked smaller, like someone had folded him up, tucking the edges in and making him fit into less space. I knelt by the chair and felt the rise and fall of his breath. I reached for his hand. It felt frail, a worn rope unraveling at the ends. For 8 years, my father had barely touched me. We wore our distance like armor. But in that moment, when he closed his eyes and I brushed his fingertips, he didn't pull away. He held on. Then he opened his eyes and looked at me. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That look said more. My mother, Eleanor, was in the bedroom. She didn't come out when I arrived. She didn't come out for days. I heard her crying by the window. Quiet sobs behind closed doors. Olivia was across the country in Austin, handling a corporate merger she said was urgent. She didn't call, didn't visit. She texted once some days later, "Hope he gets better." I didn't call anyone else. I didn't tell them how close he came. I didn't tell them I was there, holding him, asking him to breathe, telling him over and over, "It's okay. You're okay." I lied to him to make him believe it. He recovered, slow and messy. For 3 months, I stayed in that old brick house with peeling paint and overgrown vines. I slept in his guest room, rinsing out uniform patches in the bathroom sink at night. Mornings, I helped him sit up, set out eggs and toast on a tray. I shifted his 4 bags. I held the flashlight for him when he could barely see. I wiped sweat from his forehead during the first summer heat wave and rubbed his back as he fell asleep. On his bad days, he was quiet. On his better days, he stared at me late at night like he was memorizing my face. One night, I caught him staring at my uniform folded on a chair. He whispered, "You did good, proud." I swallowed hard. I didn't say, "Thank you." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, blinked back tears, then left the room. The community whispered I was back for inheritance. They didn't see that every morning I woke to patch him together. They didn't know the smell of antiseptic. They didn't know how I spent hours reading his favorite military memoir, trying to spark conversation. He never asked me about my deployment scars. He never talked about the war. He never once said, "Victoria, you're the best of us." But I saw it in him. I felt it in his hold of my hand. It was September when he fell again, harder this time. So the next time, hospital staff called me first. I ran down the porch steps in my uniform shirt and rain boots. No dress blues. I didn't need ceremony then. I just needed to get him to safety. When the ambulance came, Mother appeared on the sidewalk in slippers and a robe. She didn't speak when I rushed past her to hold my father's hand again. Olivia flew home 2 days later. And then he died. I held his hand in the hospital room. I told him it was okay for him to rest. He squeezed my fingers once and let go. He left this house to me. I inherited the burden and the echoes of silence between us. I inherited the responsibility of keeping his memory alive while my own family turned against me. During those 3 months, I learned more about him than any promotion or medal ever taught me. I learned patience. I learned humility. I learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is just show up. And after he died, they called me selfish. They called me manipulative. They said I'd taken advantage of his illness. They called me a homeowner, not a daughter. What they didn't know was how much I'd bled caring for him. What they didn't know was how much I'd held him in war and in recovery. What they didn't know was that my silence while caring for him was love, not motive. I didn't argue. I didn't post photos. I didn't respond to the rumors. I had learned earlier that noise cannot drown out trust. Trust is built in quiet moments. But when they brought those accusations into court, I realized silence wasn't enough anymore. I rose from that house the day he died. I walked out wearing boots scuffed with soil and a heart bruised with loss. I carried his memory in my uniform pocket. I carried my service and my story. Now I carry them here into that courtroom again. Only this time, I won't stay silent. Because I know what silence can hold and what it can finally release when the right moment arrives. There was a time I believed my father hated me. Not because he said it, but because of how loudly he said nothing. It was senior year. I'd just withdrawn from law school mid-semester. I didn't tell anyone until it was already done. I remember walking into the kitchen of our house wearing jeans, a hoodie, and a duffel bag slung across my shoulder. My mother stood by the sink, polishing wine glasses we never used. My father sat at the head of the table, reading the Wall Street Journal. "I'm not going back," I said. "No theatrics, no speech." My mother paused for half a breath. Then she resumed drying the glass like I hadn't spoken. My father lowered the paper an inch, just enough for his eyes to meet mine. The disappointment in them didn't sting. It burned. I could already feel it tightening in my chest. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I dropped out," I answered. He folded the paper slowly, deliberately, placed it on the table, pushed his chair back, and stood up. "You're the first Sterling to quit anything," he said. I nodded. "I'm enlisting," I said. The room cracked open. The silence was so sharp, I could hear the ice melt in the water glass beside him. He walked toward me, stiff military posture still intact. Then, before I had time to step back, he slapped me across the face, just once. Not hard enough to leave a bruise, but hard enough to knock something loose. Maybe it was respect, or fear, or the last shred I had left of being his daughter. "You are not taking our name and dragging it through the dirt," he snapped. I stood there steady. Didn't cry. Didn't yell. I just looked at him and said, "I'm not dragging it through the dirt. I'm just not hiding behind it anymore." He turned and left the room. My mother still hadn't spoken. She hadn't turned around. When I left for basic training 3 weeks later, she didn't come to the airport. He didn't write. No one called. Not on graduation. Not when I earned my stripes. Not even when my name showed up in the Army Times after my first deployment. They acted like I'd vanished, but I didn't vanish. I changed. And it was in the desert that I learned something else, something no family lesson had ever taught me. Silence in war zones is deadly. It's the moment right before an IED goes off. It's the stillness before sniper fire cuts through the dust. It's the gap between screams when someone realizes they're bleeding too fast to stop it. At home, silence had been the punishment. With my mother, it was a slow suffocation, a room you were in but never acknowledged. With my father, it was something you had to earn your way back into. But in combat, silence was survival. And sometimes silence meant someone had died before they could scream. So I learned to read quiet like a language. I learned to hear the tremble in breath, the difference between discipline and panic. I became fluent in things people didn't say. That's why years later, when my father had his first stroke and couldn't form words, I didn't need him to speak. I already understood silence better than most people understood sound. But back then, after that slap in the kitchen, I thought I'd lost everything. My place, my father, my worth. What I didn't realize was that I had traded their silence for one I could live with, my own. The Army didn't ask me to prove my bloodline. It asked me to prove my backbone. And when it did, I gave it everything. I gave it 18-hour days in combat boots. I gave it my sleep, my knees, my sanity. I gave it friends I loved and couldn't save. And somewhere along the way, I stopped looking back at the kitchen table at the man who stood there thinking he could break me with his silence and a slap. Because I had stepped into a world where people yelled to live. And in that world, my silence became a weapon, not a wound. I never told my family any of this. Not when I came back with medals. Not when I earned the one they said no woman would ever earn, because you don't hand your story to people who never asked for it. You build a new one quietly, steadily, and if they don't hear it, that's on them. The courtroom was colder that morning, not physically, but in the way people looked at me. It was the second day of the trial. Olivia had arrived wearing black, though our father had died nearly 6 months ago. She sat beside our mother like a beautiful daughter. Her arm lightly around Mom's shoulder, eyes lowered just enough to appear mournful, but not enough to miss the cameras. And then she stood, calmly, too calmly. "Your Honor," she said with permission, "I'd like to submit a short video for the court to consider." It was taken from the hallway camera outside my father's room, recorded the night before his passing. My attorney didn't object. He didn't even look surprised. The judge nodded. The screen lit up. There I was, pixelated but recognizable, standing just outside Dad's bedroom door. "You never respected me," my voice echoed from the speakers. "All I ever did was try." "You disrespected the family name," came his reply, muffled but audible. "You never wanted a daughter. You wanted a soldier you could parade in courtrooms and country clubs. And look at what you became," he snapped. Silence. Then I turned, hand trembling on the doorknob, voice breaking just enough to sound harsh. "Maybe I became what you made me." The video cut off. That was it. Just that. No context. No full recording. No next moments where I walked back in, dropped to my knees, and told him I was sorry, that I didn't want to win the argument. I just wanted him to know I stayed because I loved him, not because I had something to prove. But that part wasn't in the clip. Olivia had cut it, and the courtroom ate it up. There was an audible shift in the air. Whispers, a few headshakes. The jurors stiffened. Even the bailiff glanced away. My mother sniffled, pulling out a tissue from her clutch with such elegance you'd think she'd rehearsed it. She dabbed under her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Fake. I watched the entire performance without blinking. When the judge asked if I had a response, I stood slowly and approached the microphone. I could have explained. I could have told them what really happened. That he grabbed my wrist later that night and whispered, "I was too hard on you. I didn't know how to love you the way you needed." I could have described how his fingers curled around mine, fragile and warm for the first time in 8 years. How he asked me if I believed in second chances. How I told him yes. But I didn't say a word. I looked at Olivia. She smirked, just enough for only me to see it. I looked at my mother. She couldn't meet my gaze. Then I turned back to the judge, cleared my throat, and said, "No response, Your Honor." He nodded, confused. I returned to my seat. My attorney leaned in, whispered, "We could ask to cross-examine the footage." I shook my head. "Let them talk." "But they're painting you." "I know," I interrupted. There was a pause. He looked like he wanted to say more, but didn't. Because here's the truth. I wasn't silent because I was weak. I was silent because I was done performing for people who only showed up to watch me fall. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I didn't need to claw for sympathy. I had already lived through worse than public opinion. I had marched through war zones where silence meant survival. I had survived nights in medical tents watching soldiers younger than Olivia bleed out from decisions they didn't get to make. Compared to that, a doctored clip in a courtroom was just another version of battlefield noise. So I sat there, still straight-backed, calm. Let them misunderstand me. Let them judge, because truth doesn't need applause to be true. It just needs to be lived, and I had already lived it. The judge adjusted his glasses and sighed. You could feel the room winding down, as if the outcome was inevitable. He began shuffling papers, tapping them once against the desk, that signature movement lawyers know well, a prelude to closure. I gripped the edge of the table, not out of desperation, but out of a need to feel something solid. Everything else felt fluid, the glances, the silence, the quiet betrayal of the very people who'd once given me their name. This court is prepared to issue a preliminary finding, the judge began. And that's when the door opened. At first, no one moved. It wasn't dramatic, just a soft creak, almost an apology for interrupting. But the moment he stepped in, the room shifted. He didn't walk. He arrived, tall, almost imposing, his silver hair cropped close, shoulders still proud despite his age, dressed not in a civilian suit, but in his old military uniform, neat and pressed. Every pin and ribbon told a story no courtroom could fabricate. It was General Nathan Cole. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the judge paused, mouth still half open. The man beside me, my attorney, whispered, "That's Cole." The Cole. My mother's lips parted. Her hand flew up to her chest. Olivia's face turned pale. I saw it happen, second by second. The smug superiority dissolved into something that looked a lot like fear. General Cole walked to the center of the room, uninvited. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply looked at the judge and said, "Sir, I have something to say. She doesn't need to prove anything today. I'm here because I'm the one she saved." It was the first time in days that every face in the courtroom turned away from me. He looked directly at Olivia, then my mother, then me. His voice didn't tremble. "I was trapped under the wreckage near Helmand," he said. Our convoy had taken heavy fire. Half the men were gone, radio dead, blood everywhere, and through the smoke, she appeared alone, dragging one of our boys over her shoulder, rifle slung across her back, bullet in her thigh. I told her to leave me. She refused. He paused. She said, "We don't leave anyone behind." And she carried me half a mile. I begged her to save herself. She just said, "You're not dead yet, sir. Let's keep it that way." No one breathed. He turned to the judge again. "Whatever character they've painted here today, I need you to understand something. I owe my life to her. And I don't say that lightly. If Victoria Sterling says she loved her father, she did. If she says she cared for him when no one else did, she did. Because she doesn't perform. She acts. Always." He stepped back. Silence. Even the stenographer had stopped typing. The judge looked stunned. He blinked several times, as if trying to reboot a stalled mind. My mother looked like she had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. Olivia sat frozen, knuckles white against her thigh. But I remained still, because this wasn't vindication. It was just truth finally being allowed to stand. General Cole walked toward me, slowly, deliberately. When he reached me, he extended his hand. I stood, took it. Then he did something no one expected. He saluted me. Every muscle in his arm precise, every breath controlled. A soldier's gesture not given lightly, not performed for cameras. The judge stood too, quietly, as if the gravity in the room had shifted. I didn't smile. I didn't cry, but I felt, for the first time in weeks, the weight in my chest shift just a little, enough to breathe again. And in that moment, I knew they could tear down my name. They could twist the memories, but they could never rewrite the truth of what I carried or who I had carried. Because honor isn't something you hang around your neck. It's something you carry in your spine when no one's watching. General Cole didn't sit. He remained at the center of the courtroom, still as a monument, then slowly reached inside his coat pocket. "This," he said, "is the original Medal of Honor nomination packet filed 7 years ago. Not by me. Not by the unit, but by General Franklin Sterling." He held it up, a sealed folder with government markings. The courtroom leaned forward. The air suddenly charged like static before a storm. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, not from surprise, but from disbelief. "Father." Olivia's jaw shifted. She blinked, confused. My mother blinked faster, as if hoping the moment would vanish if she could just outpace it. He opened the folder slowly, pulled out a crisp official document with a heavy gold seal in the corner. At the bottom, in blue ink that hadn't faded a bit, was General Franklin Sterling, my father's signature. The room stirred. You could hear phones being unlocked. Olivia pulled hers out, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I could guess what she was looking up. How long does it take for a Medal of Honor to be approved? Can families be notified? Are nominations confidential? General Cole continued. General Sterling submitted this nomination through classified channels. It was during the height of a regional blackout. He asked me to keep it quiet. Cole paused, locking eyes with me. He said he didn't want the army to turn her into a poster girl before she was ready. I felt the floor slip slightly, not because it hurt, but because I had spent years assuming my father didn't believe in me, only to realize now that he had quietly fought for me behind closed doors I never had keys to. He had nominated me 7 years ago, and he never told me. Never told anyone. Cole turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, This nomination was eventually lost in the bureaucracy. The file was buried after a reassignment, but I've kept it because I knew someday she might need it. I looked down. My hand had moved on its own, now resting over my heart, right where my Medal of Honor had hung before I took it off. I didn't need to say anything. The question echoed in my chest. Why did he hide it from me? I hadn't seen that version of him in years. The man who taught me to ride a bike. The man who made me memorize Army field codes just for fun. The one who turned ice cream into reward currency after Sunday drills. That man disappeared the day I said I was leaving law school. That was the last time he slapped me. Not out of rage, but out of shame, disappointment. He called me a disgrace. He told me I had humiliated the Sterling name, and I left. Now, years later, I stood in a courtroom with my mother's tears like knives and my sister's accusations like acid, and learned that the man who rejected me had once tried to honor me in the highest way possible, not publicly, but quietly, secretly, and maybe, in his own language, lovingly. Olivia raised her voice. There's no proof it's authentic. That could be forged. Cole turned sharper this time. This packet was logged in Fort Belvoir's secure archive system. You can check the reference number. It's all there, dated, witnessed, sealed. The judge gestured for the clerk to collect it. The courtroom clerk, Rose, stepped forward and gently took the folder from Cole's hands. The moment felt ceremonial, sacred. I didn't look at Olivia. I didn't look at my mother. I looked only at the folder. Because inside, it wasn't just proof. It was a confession, a truth he hadn't known how to say. Or maybe he'd been waiting for the right moment. Maybe he'd run out of time, but now the world knew. And so did I. 6 years ago, Camp Dagger. There are places your mind doesn't go until something pulls it back. Sitting in that courtroom, seeing the nomination letter in General Cole's hands, I wasn't in Vermont anymore. I was under desert heat again. Gear heavy on my back, rifle jammed, and the radio full of static. Operation Harvest Falcon. We were 6 by the end. Just me. I still remember the smell. Burnt metal, singed cloth, and the sharp stink of panic. It was supposed to be a routine resupply run, but it turned into a war. And by the end of it, all I had left was the blood on my uniform, the sand in my teeth, and the silence.